I'm Alexandra Morgan, 34, and I never thought I'd be standing in my own penthouse watching my husband's face crumble as I revealed the truth. The carefully orchestrated betrayal between James and his father Richard had been months in the making, but they never expected I'd discover their scheme. They didn't realize the successful law firm, the ironclad Prenup, and the luxury penthouse they were plotting to take away were all mine. Before I tell you how I exposed their scheme at our family Christmas dinner, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button if you've ever had to stand up for yourself when everyone expected you to stay quiet. I grew up in a modest 3-bedroom house in Cincinnati, where my father worked as a high school math teacher and my mother ran a small bookkeeping business from our dining room table. They weren't wealthy by any stretch, but they instilled in me something far more valuable than money, an unshakable work ethic and the belief that with enough determination, I could achieve anything I set my mind to. When I announced my intention to become a lawyer in the 8th grade, my parents didn't dismiss it as a child's fantasy. Instead, they helped me map out a plan. Every summer job, every academic achievement, every extracurricular activity from that point forward had one purpose: to build a resume that would get me into a top law school with a scholarship. I babysat, waited tables, and tutored younger students, saving every dollar I could. My efforts paid off when I was accepted to Harvard Law School with a partial scholarship. Even with financial aid, I had to take out substantial student loans, but I never questioned whether it would be worth it. I graduated in the top 5% of my class, making law review and catching the attention of several prestigious firms. I accepted a position at Barrett & Thornton, a mid-sized firm in Boston specializing in corporate law. The hours were brutal, often 80 to 90 per week, but I thrived on the challenge. After 3 years of proving myself, I was on track for partnership when an unexpected opportunity arose. Martin Hayes, one of the senior partners, pulled me aside after a particularly grueling case that we'd won against all odds. "You're wasted as someone else's employee, Alexandra," he said. "You should be running your own firm." At first, I laughed it off, but Martin was serious. He was nearing retirement and looking to invest in promising legal talent. He offered to provide initial funding to help me start my own practice, with the agreement that I'd buy him out over 5 years. Taking that leap was terrifying. I had just turned 26 with massive student debt and no safety net. But something inside me knew this was my chance. I accepted Martin's offer, found a tiny office space in a less than glamorous part of town, and Morgan Legal was born. The first 2 years were a constant struggle. I took any client who walked through the door, often working 18-hour days and sleeping on the office couch. Slowly but surely, I built a reputation for being thorough, innovative, and relentless. By year 3, I had hired 2 associates and moved to a slightly better location. By the time I turned 30, Morgan Legal had grown to 15 employees with a reputation for excellence in corporate law, particularly in mergers and acquisitions. I had not only paid off Martin's investment but had also cleared my student loans and was generating significant profits. The 5-year plan I had initially outlined had exceeded all expectations, and my name was becoming well known in Boston's legal circles. With financial success came personal freedoms I'd never experienced before. I purchased a stunning penthouse in one of Boston's most desirable buildings, 3,000 square feet of luxury with floor-to-ceiling windows and a terrace overlooking the city. After years of sacrificing every comfort, I finally had the means to enjoy the finer things in life. It was at a charity gala for the Boston Children's Hospital that I first met James Whitney. At 36, he was handsome in that polished, old-money way, confident, charming, and immediately attentive. He approached me at the bar, introduced himself as an investment manager, and within minutes had me laughing about the pretentiousness of these events while simultaneously writing a sizable donation check. "You seem different from the usual crowd here," he said, his eyes holding mine a moment longer than necessary. Less concerned with who's watching and more focused on the actual cause. I was instantly drawn to him. Our first date stretched from dinner to drinks to a sunrise walk along the harbor. Within weeks, we were virtually inseparable. James was unlike anyone I'd dated before, cultured, worldly, and seemingly in awe of my accomplishments. He listened intently when I talked about my firm, asked insightful questions, and never seemed intimidated by my success. 9 months into our relationship, during a weekend trip to the Berkshires, James proposed with a vintage emerald ring that had belonged to his grandmother. In that moment, I felt like I'd finally found someone who truly saw me for who I was, not just a successful lawyer, but a woman worthy of love and respect. We were married in a small ceremony 3 months later. I had suggested a prenuptial agreement, given my assets and the firm, but James seemed almost hurt by the suggestion. "I'm not marrying you for your money, Alexandra," he said with such sincerity that I felt guilty for bringing it up. Nevertheless, I quietly had my firm's legal team draw up a solid prenup, which James signed without much review. I didn't emphasize the extent of my assets or that the penthouse where we would be living was solely in my name. Perhaps that was my first mistake. Wanting to be loved for myself, not my success, I downplayed just how much I had built on my own. When I first met James's family, his father Richard seemed genuinely interested in my career. He asked detailed questions about how I'd built my practice and even introduced me to some of his business associates. His mother Margaret was polite but more reserved, clearly from a generation where wives took a background role. James's younger sister Elizabeth, Liz for short, was immediately warm and welcoming, pulling me aside to whisper, "Thank God James finally found someone with a brain and a backbone." Over time, I noticed subtle shifts in Richard's attitude toward me. The interested questions about my firm became veiled suggestions about how I might eventually want to step back to focus on family. When I mentioned expanding to a second office location, Richard remarked that I was certainly ambitious for a new wife, as if the two roles were somehow incompatible. James never directly echoed his father's sentiments, but neither did he contradict them. I began to notice other worrying signs I had overlooked during our whirlwind romance. The genuine interest he'd shown in my career seemed to wane. He made comments about my work hours and suggested I delegate more so we could attend social functions with his friends and family. I also couldn't help but notice James's expensive tastes, the designer suits, premium golf club membership, and weekend trips to exclusive resorts. He contributed to our household expenses from his investment job, but I realized I was funding the majority of our lifestyle. Whenever I brought up financial planning or budgeting, James would charm his way out of the conversation, assuring me everything was fine. Looking back, the warning signs were there from the beginning. But I was so enchanted by the idea that I'd found a true partner, someone who claimed to value my intelligence and independence, that I willfully ignored the red flags waving right in front of my face. The Whitney family legacy stretched back 4 generations to James's great-grandfather, who had made a fortune in shipping during the early 1900s. They were Boston aristocracy, with their name on university buildings and hospital wings. However, what I didn't know until later was that the Whitney fortune had been steadily declining over the past 2 decades. Richard Whitney, my father-in-law, had inherited the family investment firm but lacked his father's business acumen. A series of poor investments in the early 2000s, followed by the 2008 financial crisis, had decimated much of their wealth. The family still maintained appearances, the ancestral home in Beacon Hill, membership in the right clubs, and donations to the right charities, but it was increasingly funded by selling off assets and property. Despite their financial reality, Richard was obsessed with maintaining the Whitney family image. Everything was about perception and status. The right schools, the right connections, the right marriages, all carefully calculated to preserve their position in Boston's social hierarchy. Richard measured success not by personal achievement but by how one was regarded in their social circles. James had been raised as the golden child and heir to the Whitney legacy. From an early age, he was groomed to take over the family business and restore its former glory. He attended Phillips Exeter Academy, then Yale, followed by Wharton for his MBA, all prestigious institutions that suited the Whitney image. What became increasingly clear to me was that James had never faced real consequences for his actions. When he underperformed academically, Richard made calls to ensure he wasn't held back. When he was caught driving under the influence in his early 20s, charges mysteriously disappeared. His entire life had been a series of rescues and second chances orchestrated by his father. Margaret Whitney, my mother-in-law, was the perfect society wife, elegant, discreet, and completely deferential to her husband. She ran their household with precision, organized impeccable social gatherings, and never publicly disagreed with Richard. In private, I occasionally caught glimpses of a sharper intelligence and dry wit, but she had long ago decided that her role was to support Richard's ambitions, not pursue her own. The only Whitney who seemed to have escaped this dysfunctional dynamic was Liz. For years younger than James, she had rebelled against family expectations by attending a state university and pursuing a career in environmental science. Richard viewed her choices as disappointing, which only strengthened Liz's resolve to forge her own path. From my first introduction to the family, Liz appointed herself as my ally and interpreter of Whitney family politics. "Don't take Dad's intensity personally," she advised me early on. "He sees everyone as either a tool to advance the family or an obstacle to be removed." Family gatherings typically occurred at the Whitney estate, a sprawling federal-style mansion that had been in the family for generations. These events were steeped in tradition, specific foods served on specific occasions, formal attire required for dinner, and detailed protocols about who sat where. It felt like stepping into a period drama where everyone knew the script except me. Christmas was the pinnacle of Whitney traditions. The annual Christmas Eve dinner was a formal affair with selected friends and associates, followed by Christmas Day with immediate family only. Richard used these gatherings to reinforce family hierarchy and make pronouncements about the coming year's expectations. From the beginning, I made sincere efforts to fit in with the Whitney family culture, despite finding it stifling. I researched appropriate gifts, learned the proper way to address their older friends, and tried to participate in traditions that seemed archaic to me. I wanted James to see that I was willing to embrace his family, even if their values differed from mine. Yet no matter how I tried, there were constant subtle reminders that I didn't truly belong. Richard would make passing comments about new money lacking the refinement that comes from generational wealth. Margaret would gently correct my table etiquette or choice of attire. At social gatherings, I was introduced as James's wife who has that little law firm, as if my professional success was a cute hobby rather than a significant achievement. Most troubling was the way the Whitney men, Richard and increasingly James, spoke about working women. They viewed female ambition as somehow unnatural or temporary. When a family friend mentioned his daughter's promotion to hospital administrator, Richard remarked, "That's wonderful until she starts her family, of course." The assumption that a woman's career was secondary to her role as wife and mother was deeply ingrained in their worldview. James never directly echoed these sentiments when we were alone, but neither did he challenge them. In group settings, he would sometimes join in the patronizing comments, looking to his father for approval. It was as if he became a different person around Richard, less the supportive partner I thought I'd married and more the entitled heir apparent. Liz noticed my growing discomfort with these dynamics. During a rare moment alone at a summer garden party, she warned me more directly than before. "They have expectations for James's wife that you're not meeting," she said, keeping her voice low as we strolled through the rose garden. "They thought your success was a selling point they could brag about to their friends, but they didn't expect you to actually prioritize your career." "James knows who I am," I replied, though even as I said it, I felt a flicker of doubt. "He's always supported my work." Liz gave me a look of such pity that I felt a chill despite the summer heat. "James has never gone against Dad's wishes in his entire life," she said. "Not once. Just, be careful, Alexandra. Watch out for yourself because no one in this family will." I dismissed her warning as overly dramatic, born from her own complicated relationship with her father. James and I had our issues like any couple, but surely he wouldn't fundamentally betray me just to please his father. I couldn't have been more wrong. I first met Natalie Reynolds at a Whitney family 4th of July celebration, 6 months into my marriage with James. She was introduced as the daughter of Richard's college roommate and longtime friend. With her ash blonde hair, delicate features, and impeccable pedigree, Radcliffe-educated, from a prominent Philadelphia family, she embodied everything the Whitneys valued in a woman. "Natalie has just moved to Boston to work for the Peabody Foundation," Richard announced to the gathering, his hand resting paternally on her shoulder. We'll have to make sure she meets all the right people. What struck me immediately was how perfectly Natalie fit into the Whitney world. She knew all the social protocols, laughed at the inside jokes, and referenced shared memories from summers in the Hamptons where apparently the Reynolds and Whitneys had neighboring properties. Unlike me, she required no explanations or guidance, she belonged effortlessly. I thought little of it until Natalie began appearing at every family function, always seated near James. Richard consistently maneuvered seating arrangements to place them together, while I was often at the opposite end of the table. Margaret would comment on what a lovely young woman Natalie was, with pointed glances in my direction as if making an unfavorable comparison. At first, I tried to befriend her, assuming her constant presence was Richard and Margaret's attempt to help her build a social circle in a new city. But Natalie maintained a polite distance, her smile never quite reaching her eyes when we spoke. Over the next several months, I noticed increasingly obvious flirtation between Natalie and James. It was subtle at first, inside jokes, lingering glances, casual touches that lasted a beat too long. When I entered a room where they were talking, they would immediately create physical distance between themselves or change the subject. Meanwhile, Richard's preference for Natalie became impossible to ignore. He sought her opinion on matters he'd never ask me about and praised qualities in her that he criticized in me. Natalie understands the importance of family obligations, he would say after I'd missed a social event due to work. Or, Natalie has such natural grace at these functions, when I struggled with the intricacies of Whitney social politics. After a particularly obvious evening where Richard had seated Natalie beside James at a dinner party while I was placed at the opposite end of the table, I confronted my husband. "What's going on with you and Natalie?" I asked directly when we returned home. "And don't tell me I'm imagining things." James's reaction was textbook deflection. He laughed dismissively, accused me of being paranoid, and turned the conversation back on me. "This is what happens when you work too much," he said, his tone patronizing. "You start imagining problems that don't exist. Natalie is practically family, I've known her since we were children." "That's not what you told me when I first met her," I pointed out. "You acted like she was just a casual acquaintance." "Why are you so insecure?" he countered, his expression hardening. "Is this really about Natalie, or is it about you feeling like an outsider with my family?" "Because that's on you, Alexandra. You've never really tried to fit in." His gaslighting was so skillful that for a moment, I questioned my own perceptions. Maybe I was overreacting? Maybe years of having to prove myself in male-dominated spaces had made me too defensive? But my instincts wouldn't be silenced. One evening while James was showering, his phone lit up with a text message that I could see from where I was sitting. It was from Natalie, "Can't wait for tomorrow. Our usual place at 1 p.m?" I hadn't been raised to snoop, but self-preservation overrode my principles. I checked his message history with Natalie and found dozens of exchanges, making plans to meet, inside jokes about family gatherings, and veiled comments about the future and when things change. While there was nothing explicitly romantic, the secretive nature of their relationship was clear. James had never mentioned these meetings to me. Rather than confront him immediately, I decided to gather more information. Years of legal training had taught me never to enter a battle without all the facts. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before showing my hand. I hired Thomas Reed, a private investigator recommended by a colleague who handled divorce cases. I felt a stab of shame giving him this assignment, investigating my own husband, but the alternative was willful ignorance, and I'd never been one to bury my head in the sand. Thomas was thorough and discreet. Over the next 3 weeks, he documented multiple meetings between James and Natalie, lunches, coffee dates, even an afternoon spent shopping for jewelry. More damning were the meetings that included Richard, where the three of them huddled in serious conversation at private clubs or in Richard's office. When Thomas delivered his final report, it included photographs, dates, times, and even some audio recorded in public spaces. In one particularly clear image, Richard was handing James a document while Natalie looked on, her hand resting intimately on James's arm. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Something was happening behind my back, involving my husband, his father, and this woman who had been systematically inserted into our lives. That night, I lay awake beside James, studying his sleeping profile in the darkness. This man who had promised to love and honor me was actively betraying me. The realization wasn't just heartbreaking, it was infuriating. The scale of the deception, the calculated nature of it, struck at the core of my identity. I'd always prided myself on being intelligent and perceptive. How had I missed this? But even as I asked the question, I knew the answer. I'd wanted so badly to believe that James loved me for myself, not my success or my assets, that I'd ignored every warning sign. I'd been so determined to prove I could have both professional success and personal happiness that I'd chosen to see only what I wanted to see. No more. Whatever game they were playing, I wouldn't be the unwitting pawn. I would find out exactly what was happening, and I would protect myself. After all, I hadn't built a successful law firm by being naive or easily manipulated. Little did James know that as he slept peacefully beside me, his carefully constructed betrayal was already beginning to unravel. The first concrete piece of the puzzle fell into place entirely by accident. I had returned home early from a client meeting that had been unexpectedly cancelled and was about to announce my presence when I heard voices from Richard's study, a room he used when visiting our penthouse. "Alexandra is becoming a problem," Richard was saying, his tone clinical and detached, as if discussing a business matter rather than his daughter-in-law. "She's asking questions about your meetings with Natalie." "I've handled it," James replied. "She believes they're innocent catch-ups with an old family friend." "That's not good enough," Richard snapped. "We need to accelerate the timeline. The longer we wait, the more chance she has to realize something's happening and protect her assets." There was a pause before James spoke again, his voice lower. "What about the prenup?" "Her lawyer drew it up pretty tight." "Every contract has loopholes," Richard said dismissively. "If we can prove she concealed assets or misrepresented her net worth, we might have grounds to challenge it. Especially if you claim emotional distress from discovering your wife wasn't honest about her financial situation." I stood frozen outside the door, my hand covering my mouth to prevent any sound escaping. The betrayal was so much worse than I had imagined. This wasn't just an affair, they were actively plotting against me, targeting my assets, my company, everything I'd built. "And once we're past the prenup?" James asked. "Then we move forward with selling her firm to Caldwell Partners," Richard answered. "They've already expressed interest, and with you holding power of attorney as her husband, we can make a compelling case if she's unable to make sound decisions." The implication in his voice sent a chill through me. What exactly were they planning to make me unable to make sound decisions? "And Natalie?" James's voice had an eager quality that twisted in my gut like a knife. "She's on board completely," Richard assured him. "She understands what needs to happen. Once Alexandra is out of the picture and the assets are secured, you'll be free to move forward with someone more suitable. I've promised to restore your full inheritance once this situation is resolved properly." I'd heard enough. I silently retreated to the elevator and left the building, my mind racing. I needed to get away before I confronted them and potentially showed my hand too early. I needed to think, to plan, to protect myself. Over the next week, I began a careful investigation of my own. I searched James's home office while he was at the gym, photographing documents I found hidden in a locked drawer, including detailed valuations of my law firm and analyses of my personal assets. There were notes about my penthouse's market value and investment portfolio. Most disturbingly, there was a consultation summary from a divorce attorney specializing in high-net-worth separations, dated 3 months earlier, just 6 months into our marriage. I discovered James had been meeting with Thomas Caldwell, the managing partner of a corporate law firm that had previously tried to acquire my company. I found emails discussing the Morgan acquisition with timelines and valuation figures far below market value. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. They weren't just planning to end our marriage, they intended to strip me of everything I'd built. The firm I'd created from nothing, the wealth I'd earned through years of 70-hour work weeks, even my home, all of it was targeted in their scheme. My next step was to speak with Megan Davis, my closest friend and law partner at Morgan Legal. I needed to know if James had approached anyone at the firm directly. We met for lunch at a small cafe far from our office or any Whitney family haunts. "I need to ask you something important," I said after we ordered. "Has James contacted you about anything relating to the firm? Partnership restructuring, potential buyers, anything like that?" Megan's hesitation told me everything before she even spoke. "He called me about 3 weeks ago," she finally admitted. "Said he wanted to discuss the future of the firm and how the partnership might evolve if you decided to focus on family in the coming years." The familiar phrase, "focus on family," was straight from Richard's playbook. "What did you tell him?" I asked, working to keep my voice steady. "That any discussions about the firm's future needed to include you as the founding partner," she said firmly. "Alexandra, what's going on?" I got the distinct impression he was feeling out whether the other partners would support changes that you hadn't initiated. I took a deep breath and shared everything: the meetings with Natalie, Richard's involvement, and the documents I'd found. As I spoke, Megan's expression shifted from concern to outrage. "Those manipulative bastards," she said when I finished. "They really thought they could just swoop in and take everything you've built. Not while I'm breathing." Her immediate loyalty brought tears to my eyes, the first I'd allowed myself since discovering the plot. For weeks I'd been holding everything inside, maintaining a facade of normalcy while conducting my investigation. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I feel so stupid, Megan. I married a man who was targeting me from the beginning. How did I not see it?" "Because you're a good person who assumes others have the same integrity you do," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "But now you know, and Alexandra Morgan doesn't go down without a fight. We need to protect the firm and your assets immediately." That evening, for the first time since discovering the betrayal, I allowed myself to truly fall apart. Alone in my office after hours, I sobbed until I could barely breathe, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the deception and my own naivety. When the tears finally subsided, I called the two people who had always been my foundation, my parents. I hadn't told them anything about my suspicions until now, not wanting to worry them unnecessarily. But I needed their perspective, their unwavering support. "You've been outmaneuvering sharper legal minds than these two since you were in law school," my father reminded me after I'd explained the situation. "They made a critical error in underestimating you, Alexandra." "You've always had the strength to do what's necessary," my mother added. "Even when it's painful. That's what sets you apart. You never take the easy road if it's not the right one." Their confidence in me was the final piece I needed. As I hung up the phone, clarity washed over me. I knew exactly what I needed to do. The Whitneys had orchestrated their scheme around Christmas, when family traditions and appearances were most important to them. It was the perfect setting for my response. I would let their plan continue to unfold, allowing them to believe I remained ignorant. And when they made their move at the Christmas gathering, I would be ready with a countermove they would never forget. The morning after my conversation with Megan and my parents, I called Daniel Harrington, the top divorce attorney at a competing firm. I chose someone outside my own practice to ensure complete confidentiality and to avoid any conflicts of interest. His reputation for handling high-profile, contentious divorces was legendary in Boston legal circles. "Based on what you've told me, we need to move quickly to secure your assets," Daniel advised during our first meeting. "The good news is your prenup is solid. I've reviewed it thoroughly. The bad news is they seem determined to find a way around it." "What's the most effective strategy?" I asked, my legal training kicking in. In the courtroom, I was known for being methodical and strategic rather than emotional. I needed to apply the same approach to my personal crisis. "Documentation is key," Daniel explained. "We need to establish an irrefutable timeline of your asset acquisition prior to marriage. We need to prove your firm's value was established before you met James. And we need evidence of their conspiracy to challenge the prenup and seize control of your assets." Over the next 2 weeks, I worked with Daniel to compile comprehensive documentation of my pre-marriage assets. We gathered bank statements, property records, and business valuations dating back to the founding of Morgan Legal. I retrieved the original deed to the penthouse and proof of all renovations I'd funded before meeting James. I also secured all company documentation, updating security protocols at the firm to remove James's access credentials. With Megan's help, I informed key clients about potential restructuring rumors they might hear, without divulging the personal details behind them. The most vulnerable point in their plan is the attempt to challenge the prenup, Daniel advised. If James claims you concealed assets, we need definitive proof that he was fully aware of your financial situation. This presented a challenge since I had intentionally downplayed my wealth during our relationship. However, a thorough search of our communication history revealed several exchanges where I had mentioned specific assets or the firm's value. More damning was an email from James to his father, forwarded to me accidentally months earlier, where he specifically referenced Alexandra's 8-figure net worth and the potential to expand her firm's client base into our circles. I moved all essential documents and valuables to a secure location, a safety deposit box accessible only to me. I transferred digital copies of important files to encrypted storage that even my firm's IT department couldn't access without specific authorization. With Daniel's guidance, I set up separate banking accounts and transferred reasonable sums to ensure I would have immediate access to funds if needed. We were careful to avoid any actions that could be construed as hiding assets, documenting every transfer with clear business justifications. I also began recording conversations with James whenever legally possible. Massachusetts law required one-party consent for recordings, which meant I could record our interactions without informing him as long as I was part of the conversation. One evening, I deliberately brought up the topic of the firm's future, telling James the first was considering bringing on additional partners. "That sounds like a major decision," he replied, his interest visibly piqued. "Would you be diluting your ownership?" "Potentially," I said, watching him carefully. "I'm weighing my options." Caldwell Partners reached out again about acquiring us. "I think I mentioned them to you before?" A flash of panic crossed his face before he controlled his expression. "I don't recall that," he said smoothly. "But it's interesting they're persistent. Have they made an offer?" "Not formally," I replied. "Why? Do you think I should consider selling?" "It could be worth exploring," he said, too quickly. "You work so hard, Alexandra. Maybe it would be good to cash out while the firm's value is high and focus on other priorities." The recording captured his obvious interest in the sale prospect, contradicting his later claim that he was completely uninvolved in firm matters. It was another piece of evidence showing his active role in the scheme. As the weeks passed and Christmas approached, I maintained a careful facade of normalcy. I attended Whitney family functions, smiled through Richard's condescending comments, and pretended not to notice the meaningful glances between James and Natalie. Every moment was an exercise in self-control, but years of high-stakes negotiations had taught me how to keep my true thoughts hidden. I did, however, reach out to Liz. While I couldn't be certain of her loyalty, my instincts told me she wasn't part of their plan. We met for coffee at a small cafe well away from her family's usual haunts. "Something's happening with James, your father, and Natalie Reynolds," I said directly after we'd exchanged pleasantries. "I need to know if you're aware of it." Liz's face fell, confirmation enough before she even spoke. "I was hoping you knew," she said quietly. "I've tried to hint to you that something wasn't right." "How long have you known?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "I overheard Dad and James talking about 3 months ago," she admitted. "Dad was saying that with the right strategy, James could secure your assets while avoiding the prenup limitations. When I confronted James later, he fed me some story about protecting you from business risks and safeguarding your joint future." "And you believed that?" I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. "Of course not," she said firmly. "I told him he was making a terrible mistake and that if he didn't come clean with you, I would. He promised he would talk to you, but obviously that was a lie." I studied her, looking for any signs of deception. "Why should I believe you're not part of this too?" Because I've spent my entire life watching my father manipulate people to get what he wants, she said, her eyes flashing with old anger. I've seen how he uses James's desperate need for approval to control him. And I genuinely like you, Alexandra. You're the only person in James's life who sees him for who he really is, not who Dad wants him to be. Her sincerity seemed genuine. What about Natalie? I asked. What's her role in all this? She's been waiting in the wings for years, Liz explained. Her family lost most of their money in the recession, but they still have the name and connections Dad values. He's always thought she would be perfect for James, controllable, socially appropriate, and desperate enough for financial security that she'll play by his rules. The pieces were falling into place. Are they planning something specific for Christmas? I asked. Liz nodded. Dad intends to announce he's restoring James's full inheritance, contingent on certain family changes in the new year. It's his way of publicly backing whatever James does next. I think they expect you to be blindsided and emotionally compromised in front of everyone. Then they don't know me very well, I said, my resolve hardening. Liz reached across the table and squeezed my hand. What are you going to do? Exactly what they'd planned, I replied, except I'll be the one controlling the narrative. I need to ask you something difficult, Liz. When this all comes out, which side will you stand on? She didn't hesitate. Yours. Dad's controlling manipulation destroyed my mother's spirit and is corrupting my brother. I won't let him claim another victim. Her unwavering response cemented my decision. Then I need your help with one more thing. As the Whitney family Christmas Eve dinner approached, I finalized every detail of my response. I rehearsed what I would say, anticipating their likely reactions and preparing counterarguments. I role-played different scenarios with Daniel, ensuring I could maintain composure regardless of how they responded. The night before the gathering, I stood in front of the bedroom mirror, practicing one last time. The woman who stared back at me was not the same person who had walked into the Whitney family a year earlier, hopeful, perhaps naive, and desperate for acceptance. This woman was clear-eyed, resolute, and unafraid to stand alone if necessary. You built everything you have from nothing, I told my reflection. No one can take that away unless you let them. In the morning, I would face the people who had conspired to destroy everything I'd worked for. But unlike them, I would do it honestly, directly, and with my integrity intact. The Whitney Christmas Eve dinner was always an elaborate affair, with specific traditions maintained year after year. The historic dining room would be transformed with antique silver candelabras, the table set with Wedgwood china that had been in the family for generations, and garlands of fresh pine and holly draped across the mantelpiece. Margaret supervised every detail, from the precise folding of the napkins to the positioning of the name cards, each written in her elegant calligraphy. This year, I noticed immediately that the seating arrangement had been altered. In previous gatherings, I had been placed beside James, as was proper for a married couple. Tonight, I found my name card at the far end of the table, with Richard at the head and James seated between Natalie and his mother on the opposite side. The symbolism wasn't subtle, I was being physically distanced from the family unit. I smiled politely and took my assigned seat, exchanging pleasantries with the elderly couple beside me, longtime friends of the Whitney family who seemed vaguely confused about who I was. Across the table, Liz caught my eye and gave me an almost imperceptible nod of support. Richard was in rare form, holding court at the head of the table in a velvet smoking jacket that seemed better suited to a previous century. He was drinking more than usual, his cheeks flushed as he regaled the guests with stories of Whitney Christmases past. Tradition is the cornerstone of family, he proclaimed, raising his crystal wine glass. It's what distinguishes those with a legacy from those merely passing through. His gaze flicked briefly toward me on the words passing through, a microaggression so practiced that most guests wouldn't have noticed. James laughed appreciatively at his father's pronouncement, while beside him, Natalie nodded in earnest agreement. Throughout the first several courses, I observed the subtle choreography taking place. Richard would direct the conversation to topics where Natalie could shine, her family connections, her volunteer work with the symphony board, her knowledge of wine pairings. James would beam at her responses while avoiding eye contact with me entirely. Margaret fluttered between topics, clearly nervous but committed to maintaining the facade of a perfect family gathering. Only Liz seemed uncomfortable with the charade, her responses terse whenever Natalie spoke. As the main course was cleared, Richard tapped his knife against his glass, the crystal emitting a clear, high tone that immediately silenced conversation. "Before dessert, I'd like to share some news that makes this Christmas particularly special," he announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward him. I straightened in my chair, sensing that the moment I had been preparing for had arrived. "Family legacy has always been my highest priority," Richard continued. "Ensuring the Whitney name continues with the proper resources and connections." He turned toward James with a benevolent smile. "Which is why I'm pleased to announce that I'm officially reinstating James as the primary heir to the Whitney holdings, effective immediately." Polite applause broke out among the guests, though I noted several confused glances. James's supposed disinheritance had never been publicly acknowledged. Furthermore, Richard continued when the applause subsided, the new year will bring exciting changes for the Whitney family. Changes that will restore us to our rightful position in Boston society. His gaze shifted between James and Natalie, the implication clear to anyone paying attention. James was beaming, his hand discreetly reaching toward Natalie's under the table. Natalie's expression was triumphant, though she quickly composed her features into modest gratitude when she noticed me watching. "James," Richard said, turning to his son, "perhaps you have something to discuss with Alexandra? This might be the appropriate time to address certain adjustments to your future plans." And there it was, the setup for my public humiliation. James was meant to announce our separation in front of everyone, positioning himself as the reasonable party while blindsiding me in a setting where I would be expected to maintain composure. James cleared his throat, adjusting his tie nervously. "Yes, well, Alexandra and I have some matters to discuss regarding our future arrangements." "Actually," I interrupted, my voice calm but carrying clearly across the table, "I'd like to make an announcement of my own, if you don't mind." The surprised silence that followed was deeply satisfying. This deviation from their script clearly unsettled them. Richard's smile faltered, while James looked to his father with a flash of panic. I stood, smoothing the skirt of my burgundy dress as I moved to the end of the table where I could address everyone directly. "First, I'd like to thank Margaret for hosting this lovely tradition. The dinner was exquisite, as always." Margaret nodded uncertainly, glancing at Richard for guidance he couldn't provide. "As Richard mentioned, family legacy is indeed important," I continued. "Which is why I feel it's necessary to clarify a few matters about my own legacy before any adjustments to the future are discussed." From my clutch bag, I removed a slim folder containing the documents I had prepared. "I believe there's been some confusion about my personal and professional assets that needs to be addressed." James shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Alexandra, this isn't the appropriate venue." "On the contrary," I countered smoothly, "since Richard chose this gathering to announce your reinstatement as heir and allude to your future plans, it seems perfectly appropriate to ensure everyone has accurate information." I opened the folder and removed the first document. For those who may not be aware, Morgan Legal was founded by me 5 years before I met James. It has grown to become one of Boston's top boutique firms specializing in corporate law, with a current market valuation of $28 million. I placed the valuation report on the table. The firm is held in a trust that predates our marriage, with an ownership structure that cannot be altered without unanimous approval from a board of trustees, none of whom are named Whitney. Richard's face had darkened to a dangerous shade of red, but social convention prevented him from interrupting. "Additionally," I continued, removing another document, "the penthouse where James and I have been living is solely in my name, purchased 2 years before we met, with no marital claims possible under our prenuptial agreement." Murmurs rippled through the guests. James was staring at his plate, his earlier confidence evaporated. "Speaking of our prenuptial agreement," I added, placing it on the growing stack, "it contains specific clauses protecting all premarital assets from claims in the event of divorce, including any appreciation of those assets during the marriage. It was drafted by my firm's top counsel and has been reviewed by outside experts who confirm its ironclad nature. I turned directly to Richard. Which makes your discussions with Caldwell Partners about acquiring my firm particularly interesting, given that you have no legal standing to negotiate such a transaction. Gasps and uncomfortable shifting filled the room. The elderly gentleman beside my empty seat whispered loudly to his wife, "Did she say Caldwell? Wasn't that the firm involved in that insider trading scandal last year?" Richard finally found his voice. "I don't know what you think you've heard, Alexandra, but you're clearly confused. Perhaps the pressure of your work has affected your judgment." "That's an interesting choice of words," I replied, pulling out a recorder from my bag. "Particularly since you used almost identical phrasing when discussing with James how to justify seeking power of attorney over me if I became unable to make sound decisions." I pressed play, and Richard's unmistakable voice filled the dining room. "Once we're past the prenup, then we move forward with selling her firm to Caldwell Partners. With you holding power of attorney as her husband, we can make a compelling case if she's unable to make sound decisions." The blood drained from James's face as the recording continued, capturing their discussion about getting Alexandra out of the picture and his inheritance being contingent on resolving the situation properly. When I stopped the recording, the silence in the room was absolute. Even the staff had frozen in the doorway, dessert trays suspended in shock. "There's more," I said into the silence, including documented meetings between James, Richard, and Thomas Caldwell discussing the acquisition of my firm without my knowledge or consent. Also, extensive communications between James and Natalie dating back to before our wedding. Natalie stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "This is absurd. I won't sit here and be slandered." "Slander requires the allegations to be false," I countered. "Everything I've said is documented and verifiable. Feel free to consult with legal counsel, though I wouldn't recommend Caldwell Partners, given their potential exposure in this matter." I turned back to address the stunned guests. "I apologize for disrupting the holiday traditions, but I felt it was important to correct any misconceptions before Richard's exciting changes were announced. To be absolutely clear, my firm is not for sale, my assets are legally protected, and as of this moment, I looked directly at James for the first time that evening, my marriage is over." I placed a final document on the table in front of James. "These are divorce papers citing fraud and conspiracy as grounds. Your belongings have been packed and moved to the guest apartment in your parents' building. The locks to the penthouse have been changed, and security has been instructed not to admit you." Richard pushed back from the table, rising to his full height. "How dare you come into my home and make these outrageous accusations?" "James, don't touch those papers. This is nothing but the desperate tantrum of a woman who realized she doesn't belong in this family." "On that much, we agree," I said, gathering my belongings. "I don't belong in a family that views relationships as business transactions and measures human worth by social advantage." I looked around the table. "I wish the rest of you a peaceful holiday. Margaret, thank you again for dinner." As I walked toward the door, I heard a chair move behind me. Turning, I saw Liz standing, napkin placed deliberately on the table. "I'll walk you out," she said, ignoring her father's sharp command to sit down. In the grand foyer, away from the shocked faces in the dining room, Liz hugged me tightly. "That was both terrifying and magnificent," she whispered. "Are you okay?" "I will be," I assured her. "What about you?" "There will be fallout." She shrugged, a determined set to her jaw. "It's long overdue. Someone needed to stand up to him, and I'm glad it was you." She squeezed my hand. "Keep in touch?" "Always," I promised, then stepped out into the cold December night, leaving behind the suffocating traditions and the man who had betrayed me for a life I had never wanted in the first place. As my car pulled away from the Whitney estate, I felt something unexpected breaking through the adrenaline and anger, a profound sense of liberation. For the first time since discovering their betrayal, I knew with absolute certainty that I would not just survive this, I would emerge stronger than before. The days immediately following the Christmas confrontation passed in a blur of legal meetings, security upgrades, and emotional processing. I had prepared meticulously for the professional aspects of the separation, but nothing could fully prepare me for the personal aftermath. There were moments of crushing grief, not for the loss of James, whose true character had been revealed, but for the death of what I had believed our relationship to be. I mourned the future I had imagined with a partner who respected and valued me. There were nights I woke gasping from nightmares, my mind replaying moments from our relationship with new, sinister understanding. James made several attempts to contact me in the first week, calls, texts, even showing up at my office where security promptly escorted him out. His messages oscillated between anger, "You've humiliated me in front of everyone who matters," self-pity, "I was pressured by my father, you know how he is," and desperate bargaining, "We can work through this, everything I have is because of you." His final attempt came in the form of flowers delivered to my penthouse with a card that read, "I made a terrible mistake. The life we built together is all that matters to me." The irony that he still didn't recognize that I had built everything myself was not lost on me. I donated the expensive arrangement to a nearby nursing home. Richard, predictably, responded with threats. His attorney sent intimidating letters alleging defamation and breach of privacy laws regarding the recordings. My legal team countered with evidence of conspiracy to defraud and potential charges of attempted financial elder abuse, given their plans to declare me incompetent. The threats abruptly ceased. Natalie disappeared from Boston society entirely, reportedly returning to Philadelphia where her family was dealing with their own financial scandal involving misappropriated charity funds. The most surprising development came 3 weeks after Christmas when Liz appeared at my office without warning. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes, but there was a new resolve in her expression. "I've left," she said simply when I ushered her into my private office. "Packed everything and moved out of the family property. Dad's furious, but for the first time in my life, I don't care." She had taken a position with an environmental research center in Cambridge and found a small apartment nearby. The Whitney name had opened doors for her, but she was determined to make her own way forward. Our shared experience with Richard's manipulation created an unexpected bond. What had been a cordial in-law relationship blossomed into a genuine friendship. We began meeting weekly for dinner, supporting each other through the difficult transition of separating from the Whitney family influence. The divorce proceedings moved forward with surprising efficiency. The evidence I had gathered was overwhelming, and James's attorneys advised him that contesting the prenuptial agreement would only result in more public embarrassment. 6 months after the Christmas confrontation, our divorce was finalized with minimal drama. James received nothing from the marriage except the personal items he had brought into it. Meanwhile, Morgan Legal not only survived the turbulence but thrived. The firm's reputation for integrity attracted new clients seeking legal representation they could trust implicitly. I restructured the partnership to include Megan and 2 other senior associates who had demonstrated unwavering loyalty during the crisis. As summer turned to fall, I found myself entering a new phase of healing. The raw wound of betrayal had begun to scar over. I could go days without thinking about James or the Whitneys, and when I did, the memories no longer carried the same emotional charge. Therapy played a crucial role in my recovery. My therapist, Dr. Bennett, helped me recognize patterns I had ignored, how my desire to finally have the loving partnership I'd sacrificed for during my career-building years had blinded me to James's true nature. "You didn't fail at marriage," she told me during one particularly breakthrough session. "You succeeded at self-preservation. Many people would have stayed, trying to fix something that was fundamentally broken from the beginning." With her guidance, I began to rebuild my sense of self-worth apart from my professional success. I reconnected with old friends I had neglected during my marriage, took up painting, a hobby I had abandoned in law school, and even adopted a rescue dog named Justice who became my loyal companion. One October afternoon, nearly 10 months after the divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected letter with the Whitney family crest on the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from Margaret. "Alexandra," it began, "I have struggled with whether to write this letter for many months. What happened at our home last Christmas revealed truths I had spent decades pretending not to see. While I cannot undo the harm caused to you under my roof, I can at least offer my sincere apology for my role in it. I enabled Richard's manipulations through my silence, something I am trying to address in my own life now. I wish you well and hope someday you can forgive an old woman who lacked your courage far too long. The letter brought unexpected tears. It wasn't reconciliation, too much had happened for that, but it was acknowledgement, which in its way was healing. Around the same time, I learned through legal channels that Richard had suffered significant business setbacks after several longtime associates withdrew their support following rumors about his treatment of family members. The Whitney investment firm was reportedly struggling, and their ancestral home had been quietly listed for sale. As the one-year anniversary of the Christmas confrontation approached, I made a decision that surprised even me. I established a scholarship fund for women pursuing legal education, particularly those focused on financial and elder protection law. I named it after my grandmother, who had always encouraged my professional ambitions, but in my heart, it was also a reclamation of the pain I had experienced. Something constructive and lasting would emerge from that chapter of my life. Dating again was a slow, cautious process. I had coffee with a few men introduced by trusted friends, but I felt no pressure to rush into another relationship. I had learned to be comfortable with my own company, to trust my instincts, and to value authenticity over appearances. When I did meet someone who intrigued me, a literature professor who approached me after a legal lecture I gave at his university, I moved forward with clear eyes and firm boundaries. Our conversations were refreshingly direct. He asked questions and actually listened to my answers. He seemed genuinely fascinated by my work without feeling threatened by my success. The most profound change, however, was internal. I no longer felt the need to downplay my achievements to make others comfortable. I had built something valuable through my own intelligence and determination, and I had protected it when it was threatened. That knowledge brought a quiet confidence that was different from the professional assurance I had always possessed, deeper, more personal, and unshakable. Exactly 1 year after the Christmas that had changed everything, I hosted a small gathering in my penthouse, not a holiday celebration, but a gratitude dinner. Around my table sat the people who had supported me through the darkest period: Megan, my parents, Liz, Dr. Bennett, and a few loyal friends who had stood by me without judgment. As we shared a meal and reflected on the year behind us, I realized that while the path had been painful, it had led me to a place of greater authenticity and strength. I had discovered who truly belonged in my life and, more importantly, rediscovered myself. A year ago, I said, raising my glass in a toast, I thought I was losing everything that mattered. Instead, I found what truly matters. I looked around at the genuine smiles surrounding me. To knowing your own worth, standing firm in your truth, and recognizing that family isn't always defined by blood or legal documents, but by who shows up when it matters most. The betrayal I had experienced wasn't a story I would have chosen, but it had become a chapter in my life that no longer defined me. I had written the ending on my own terms, reclaiming my narrative from those who had tried to control it. And in that reclamation, I had found something more valuable than any asset they had targeted: the unshakable knowledge that I was enough, exactly as I was, on my own terms. I'd love to hear if any of you have faced similar challenges in your life. Times when you had to stand up for yourself when everyone expected you to stay quiet. Share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if this story resonated with you. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, sometimes the greatest gift life can give us is the opportunity to rediscover our own strength when we need it most.